Nobody in that room understood why Vanessa Cole would smile and personally invite a maintenance worker to the most exclusive investor gala of the year. To the guests in their tailored suits and designer gowns, it read as entertainment. But when Adrian Pierce walked through those doors, something shifted. He didn't shrink, he didn't hesitate, and the room slowly collectively went silent. The Cole Dynamics headquarters occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, the kind of building that existed to remind people of the distance between those who owned the view and those who cleaned the windows. Everything inside was curated: the art, the lighting, the temperature, even the way the receptionist smiled. Nothing happened at Cole Dynamics by accident, including the gala. Vanessa Cole had built the company from a single pitch deck and a conference room borrowed from a friend's failing startup. That was 11 years ago. Now Cole Dynamics was weeks away from one of the most anticipated initial public offerings in the tech sector, and Vanessa had spent the better part of 3 months making sure every investor, every journalist, every person with money and influence understood exactly what they were buying into. Not just a company. A story. Her story. She was 41, precise, in the way that comes from years of deciding which details matter and discarding the rest. She wore her dark hair pulled back without a single strand out of place, and she spoke in the kind of measured cadence that made people feel they were hearing something important, even when she was saying nothing at all. Her executives feared her in the quiet way that never makes headlines, not through cruelty, but through the subtle, consistent reminder that she saw everything and forgave nothing. The annual Investor Gala was her stage. Every year, she used it to reinforce the image she had constructed so carefully, not just of the company, but of herself as the kind of leader who operated on another level. She had a habit well known among her inner circle of selecting one person from the periphery of the evening and placing them at the center of it, not out of generosity, but out of design. A struggling vendor invited to sit beside a board member. A junior analyst asked to present a slide he barely understood. The contrast always served her well. It reminded the room without her saying a word exactly where the power sat. This year, she had chosen Adrian Pierce. Most people at Cole Dynamics barely registered Adrian's existence. He was the man who appeared when a server rack overheated, or when the ventilation on the 14th floor made a sound it shouldn't. He wore a gray uniform with his name stitched above the left pocket, carried a toolkit that had seen better decades, and moved through the building with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long since stopped expecting to be noticed. He ate lunch alone, arrived before most of the staff, and left after the cleaners. He did not complain. He did not make small talk. He simply worked and worked well, and was largely invisible because of it. What almost no one knew was why he was there at all. Adrian Pierce held a graduate-level background in economic systems and infrastructure modeling. He had spent his late 20s doing high-level consulting work, the kind that produced documents rather than headlines. When that chapter of his life closed abruptly, and not entirely on his own terms, he had taken work where it was available and stable. He was a single father by then, and stability mattered more than status. He had no interest in rebuilding a career in rooms that had already shown him what they were made of. So he took the maintenance position, learned the systems, and did the job well. He had been doing it for 6 years. The building he maintained happened to be the one built on top of work that was partly his. Vanessa had noticed him, not because she paid attention to maintenance staff, but because 3 weeks earlier during a fire drill, she had been standing in the stairwell, waiting for the all clear, and found herself next to a man in a gray uniform, reading a worn copy of a dense macroeconomic theory, text the kind of book that sat on doctoral students' shelves, not in the breast pocket of someone who fixed air conditioning units. She had said nothing to him, but she had noted it the way she noted everything that seemed out of place and filed it somewhere useful. The idea came to her the following Monday. She mentioned it to Dana Wexler, her communications director, as though it were barely worth discussing. She told Dana that she wanted to invite a non-executive employee to the gala as a guest of honor, that it would humanize the brand ahead of the IPO show, that Cole Dynamics valued the people behind the scenes. Donna, who had worked for Vanessa long enough to understand the distance between what she said and what she meant, wrote it down without comment. What Vanessa meant was simpler and less flattering. She wanted a contrast. Someone whose presence in that room would make every investor unconsciously aware of the gap between where he stood and where she had arrived. Adrian Pierce, with his gray uniform and his quiet anonymity, was a perfect choice. He would stand in the middle of her carefully designed evening like a footnote, a reminder, an accent mark on her achievement. She would be gracious. She would be magnanimous. And the room would understand exactly what that magnanimity cost her. The announcement was made on a Tuesday afternoon in a staff meeting held in the glass-walled conference room on the 22nd floor. Vanessa stood at the head of the table and told the assembled team that she was proud to announce that this year's gala would include a special guest, Adrian Pierce, whose dedication and professionalism represented everything Cole Dynamics stood for. She used the words with smooth, practiced ease and kept her eyes on the room as she said his name, gauging the reaction with the precision of someone who had spent years reading people in conference rooms. The reaction was exactly what she had anticipated. A brief collective beat of surprise. Some of the senior staff exchanged glances, the kind that communicate clearly without requiring language. A few smiled in the careful way of people who know better than to react honestly in front of their employer. None of them pushed back. They never did. Word reached Adrian through Dana, who appeared at the door of the mechanical room on the 16th floor that same afternoon with a printed invitation on company letterhead. Dana was professional about it, which was the most she could offer. She handed him the envelope, explained the date and dress code, and told him transportation would be arranged if he needed it. She did not explain why he had been chosen. Adrian looked at the envelope for a moment. He set down the calibration tool he had been holding, wiped his hands on a cloth hanging from his belt, and opened it. He read it slowly with the kind of attention that suggested he was reading between the lines as much as along them. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully along its original crease and slid it back into the envelope. Dana waited. She had expected almost any reaction: discomfort, excitement, confusion, suspicion. What she had not expected was the expression he actually gave her. It was not gratitude. It was not surprise. It was something quieter and more deliberate. The expression of a man who had just seen something click into place that he had been waiting on for a long time. "I'll be there," Adrian said. That was all. Dana walked back to the elevator with the distinct and uncomfortable feeling that she had just delivered a message to the wrong person, or rather, that the message had meant something entirely different to the man who received it than to the woman who sent it. Back on the 22nd floor, Vanessa was already moving on to the next item on her agenda. Adrian Pierce had been assigned his role in the evening's production, and she expected him to play it without understanding he was playing it at all. What she did not know, what no one in that glass tower knew, was that Adrian Pierce had met Vanessa Cole before. Not in a hallway, not at a company event. Years before Cole Dynamics existed, before the pitch deck, before the funding round, before the story. She told at every investor dinner about how she had built something from nothing with only her own vision and will. He had been there at the beginning. He knew what the beginning had actually looked like, and he had been carrying that knowledge in the same quiet way he carried everything, without complaint, without announcement, waiting for the moment when it would matter most. The gala invitation sat on the small table in Adrian's apartment that evening, next to a cup of coffee he had let go cold. He had not accepted the invitation out of curiosity. He understood the role she had written for him, understood it perhaps better than she did, because he had watched her write roles for people before. He accepted because the room she was putting him in, full of investors, journalists, and board members, was the exact room where the truth he had been sitting on for years would carry the most weight. She had handed him the stage herself. She had sent a car, arranged his seat, and placed him inside the event that mattered most to her. He did not find the irony satisfying. He found it necessary. Adrian folded the invitation, set it back on the table, and went to bed at his usual hour. He was not excited. He was not nervous. He was simply a man who had decided a long time ago that the truth deserved a room, and was relieved that the room had finally arrived. The night of the gala arrived quietly indifferent to the weight that other people had loaded onto it. The Coal Dynamics event space occupied the entire top floor of the tower, and by 7 in the evening, it held the kind of crowd that made ordinary people feel like they had wandered into the wrong building. Investment partners in tailored suits. Board members with the ease of people who had not worried about money in a very long time. A handful of journalists from financial publications positioned near the bar, with the practiced detachment of people paid to observe rather than participate. Vanessa moved through the room with total ownership. She wore a deep navy gown that was elegant without being ornamental, and she greeted each arrival by name, steered conversation with invisible precision, and made every person she spoke to feel like the most important one in the room for exactly as long as was useful. Every arrangement in that space, from the seating chart to the lighting temperature, had passed through her approval. She had thought of everything. What she had thought of most was Adrian. Dana had quietly briefed the senior staff 2 days before the event. The briefing was framed as logistics, but the subtext was understood by everyone in the room. They were to be welcoming, inclusive. They were to treat Adrian with the kind of careful, deliberate warmth that in practice announces its own condescension. One of the senior analysts had asked Dana with barely concealed amusement whether they needed to brief him on which fork to use. Dana had not laughed. She had simply closed her notebook and ended the meeting. Martin Hale, the lead partner from the private equity group that stood to anchor the IPO, had heard about the guest of honor through informal channels. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with a reputation for reading people quickly and betting on the right ones. He had told his associate on the ride to the venue that he found the gesture interesting. His associate had assumed he meant admirable. Martin had not corrected him. The car that Coal Dynamics sent for Adrian arrived at his apartment building at 6:45. Adrian sat in the back seat in a dark charcoal suit that was not new but was well kept, pressed with the attention of someone who understood the difference between owning something and taking care of it. He looked out the window at the city moving past and did not appear to be rehearsing anything. He was simply present in the way of someone who has already decided what they are going to do and no longer needs to think about it. He arrived at 7:15, which was neither fashionably late nor anxiously early. The elevator doors opened onto a room already full and loud, with the energy of people performing their own success at one another. A staff member at the entrance checked his name against the list and visibly recalibrated his expression when he found it not rudely, but with the involuntary surprise of someone who had not expected the name to belong to the man standing in front of him. Adrian did not react. He accepted the small card with his table number and walked into the room. Several things happened in the next few minutes that Vanessa had not planned for. The first was that Adrian did not behave like a man who had been given access to a room above his station. He moved without hesitation, without the self-conscious stillness that marks someone who feels watched. He found his table, set his card down, and then, instead of waiting to be approached, introduced himself to the 2 people already seated nearby. One of them was a portfolio manager from a mid-sized investment firm based in Boston. The other was a journalist who covered tech IPOs for a financial publication with national reach. Adrian spoke to them the way people speak when they are genuinely interested in a conversation, not when they are trying to survive one. The portfolio manager, whose name was Greg Sutton, had been expecting to spend the first half of the evening doing the polite work of including someone who didn't quite belong. What he found instead was a man who within 4 minutes had identified the single most underreported structural risk in Coal Dynamics' IPO prospectus and articulated it with the precision of someone who had read the document more carefully than most people in the room. Greg had read the prospectus. Greg had not caught that particular issue. He set down his drink and gave Adrian his full attention. The journalist, whose name was Rachel Ford, had come to the gala expecting social conversation and background color for a profile piece she was already writing on Vanessa. She was not expecting a source. But when Greg Sutton, a man not known for giving his attention cheaply, leaned forward and started asking follow-up questions, Rachel recognized the shape of something worth documenting. She opened her notebook and began writing without drawing attention to the fact that she had done so. Vanessa noticed from across the room. The body language at that table had shifted from tolerant inclusion to genuine engagement in a way she had not staged and could not explain. She made her way across the space at a pace calibrated to look unhurried. "I see you found good company," Vanessa said, arriving at the table with a practiced smile. She addressed the comment to Greg, a way of reclaiming the conversational center without appearing to, and placed one hand briefly on the back of Adrian's chair, a gesture of ownership disguised as warmth. Greg looked up and nodded, but his response was directed at Adrian rather than at her. "Your guest was just walking me through the secondary market exposure in the pre-IPO structure. I'll be honest, I hadn't considered the angle he raised." He glanced at Vanessa with a look that was professionally courteous, but carried something underneath it. "Where did you say he came from?" Vanessa's smile did not move. "Adrian is part of our operations team," she said. The phrasing was accurate. It was also the most diminishing accurate phrasing available. Adrian looked at her directly, without hostility, without performance. "Facilities maintenance," he said, with the same ease he might use to say any true thing. 16th floor. Greg absorbed this and returned to the conversation he had been having, which told Vanessa more than she wanted to know about how the evening was unfolding. She excused herself and moved away from the table. She found Dana near the presentation screen and spoke quietly, instructing her to make sure the formal introduction segment began no later than 8:30, and that the framing around Adrian was carefully managed. Dana went to find the event coordinator without comment. By 8 o'clock, Adrian had spoken with 6 different people at and around his table. He had not announced himself or his credentials. He had simply responded to questions with a depth that made people ask more questions, and the conversations had extended themselves naturally. One of those 6 people was a woman named Patricia Owens, who ran a venture fund out of San Francisco and was known for her clinical skepticism about founder narratives. She had spent 20 minutes in conversation with Adrian and was now looking at Vanessa with the focused attentiveness of someone who has just learned that the map they came in with may not be entirely accurate. The formal program began at 8:35. Vanessa took the stage, a low-raised platform at the north end of the room, with lighting designed to isolate its occupant, and delivered her opening remarks with the confidence of someone telling a story they had told so many times it had become completely smooth, every rough edge worn away. The room listened. There was applause in the right places. Then she introduced Adrian. She did it generously, speaking about the importance of the people behind the scenes, about how Coal Dynamics' success was built on every level of contribution. She said his name, gestured toward his table, and waited for him to stand the moment she had imagined, where the contrast would be clear and quiet and serve its purpose without requiring words. Adrian stood. He was calm in the way that deep water is calm, not because nothing is moving, but because the movement is all beneath the surface. He acknowledged the applause with a slight nod. He did not look grateful. He did not look embarrassed. He looked like a man waiting for a different part of the evening to begin. After the formal program ended, Rachel Ford made her way toward Vanessa with a question framed as casual background research. She asked about the founding period of Coal Dynamics, specifically the original proposal that had secured the company's first significant funding. She mentioned that she had noticed an inconsistency in the authorship records, while reviewing early documentation for her profile piece. Vanessa's response was measured. The early days had involved a number of collaborators. Founding documents were often complicated. Her communications team would be happy to follow up. It was a clean non-answer, the kind that works when the person asking does not already know what you are not saying. Rachel thanked her and moved away, but she moved toward Adrian's table. What happened in the following 20 minutes moved through the room, not as rumor, but as a shift in atmosphere. A question raised in one corner, a response that prompted another question, two people pulling up the same document on their phones, a funding presentation from 11 years ago, cited in multiple due diligence reports, whose authorship had always been listed under Vanessa Cole alone, despite the draft history telling a more complicated story. Vanessa felt the shift before she identified its source. She scanned the room and found Rachel Ford's notebook open, speaking in a low voice to Martin Hale, who was listening with the focused stillness of someone making a significant decision. She moved toward Adrian, who had positioned himself near the edge of the room, slightly apart from the nearest group, as though he had known this moment was approaching. She stopped close enough to speak without being overheard. Her voice was quiet and stripped of its earlier warmth. "Whatever you think you know." Vanessa said, "This is not the place." Adrian looked at her with an expression that held no anger, no satisfaction, and nothing resembling a personal score being settled. It was the expression of someone who had made a decision long before tonight and was simply waiting for the conversation to arrive at this point. "The proposal that launched this company," he said, keeping his voice at the same low register. "The 47-page document that secured your first $3 million. The infrastructure model, the market entry strategy, the risk mitigation framework. The document every investor in this room has read some version of, because it's been cited in every major pitch you've made since." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You and I wrote that together. You know that. And I have the drafts." Something behind Vanessa's expression changed, not visibly, but structurally, like a wall that has taken damage you cannot see from the outside, but which can no longer hold what it held before. "You signed an NDA, she said. "I signed an NDA covering my employment at the firm where we met," Adrian said. "Not the work I did before I was employed there. Not the document we produced together as independent contractors before you pitched it as your own. I had a lawyer review it several years ago." Vanessa stood inside the noise of the room glasses being refilled, someone laughing near the bar, the city moving far below the windows, and understood with the precise clarity that comes at the end of a very long period of managed uncertainty that what she had been afraid of for 11 years had finally arrived. It had arrived because she had sent a car to pick it up. Patricia Owens appeared at her shoulder, not with accusation, with the measured tone of someone who had built a career on acting before information became public. "Vanessa," Patricia said quietly, "I think we need to talk before the evening goes any further." It was not a request. Martin Hale was already on his phone. Rachel Ford's notebook was open. 3 board members had clustered near the far wall, with the body language of people who had just realized the thing they came to celebrate may not be exactly what it appeared. Vanessa stood between Adrian and the room she had built, and for the first time in 11 years, she did not know what move to make next. Patricia Owens guided Vanessa toward the small anteroom adjacent to the main event space, a narrow room with a catering table and no windows, and she brought Martin Hale with her. It was not a gesture of support. It was the kind of move that tells a person exactly how many people already know. The 3 of them stood in that room for 6 minutes. Patricia told Vanessa in clear and unhurried language that the authorship question had surfaced with enough credibility and enough witnesses that it could not be managed with a press statement or a legal letter. Martin told her that 2 of his partners had already been contacted by someone in the room and that the IPO timeline was, as of that moment, in a condition requiring immediate reassessment. Neither of them was cruel. They were simply direct in the way that people are direct when the performance portion of an evening is ended, and what remains is consequence. Vanessa listened. Somewhere in those 6 minutes, something she had been holding at significant personal cost for 11 years. The daily discipline of a story that was almost true, the energy required to never let the almost become visible, became heavier than she could carry, and also for the first time unnecessary to carry. The IPO was already compromised. The room already knew. The question was no longer whether the truth would surface, but whether she would be the one to surface it. She walked back out into the gala. The room had the quality of a crowd pretending not to watch something. Conversations were happening, but they were thinner than before, stretched over a different attention. Rachel Ford was near the center of the room with her laptop open. Greg Sutton and Adrian were standing apart from the nearest group, not speaking, waiting with the stillness of people who understand that something significant is about to happen and that proximity matters. Several board members had drifted closer to the stage without appearing to have done so intentionally. Vanessa walked to the platform. Someone handed her a microphone without being asked. She stood in the light that had been designed to make her look like the undisputed center of the evening. She was not composed in the way she had been composed 2 hours earlier. She was composed in a different way, the way of someone who has set something down after carrying it too long and is still adjusting to the change. "I want to address something," Vanessa said. Her voice was level and carried without effort. "And I want to do it now, in this room, with the people who came tonight, because they believed in what this company represents." The ambient noise dropped, not all at once, but in the way sound recedes when people collectively decide that listening matters more than talking. 11 years ago, she continued, before Coal Dynamics existed, before there was a pitch or a funding round or a company name, there was a document. 47 pages. It outlined the infrastructure model and market entry strategy that became the foundation of everything I built here. I have spent 11 years presenting that document as mine alone. The idea, the research, the framework, all of it attributed solely to me. And that was not accurate. Rachel Ford's pen was moving. Martin Hale had put his phone away. Adrian Pierce and I worked on that proposal together. We were both independent contractors at the time, brought in for the same project by the same firm. We developed the framework side by side over several weeks. When the firm dissolved and the opportunity to pitch independently emerged, I moved forward alone. I filed the documentation in my name alone. I took the meeting alone. I took the credit alone. Vanessa's voice did not waver, but it had lost the performance quality it usually carried. What replaced it was simpler. Adrian knew, and he has carried that for 11 years, while working in this building in the maintenance department, on the 16th floor, and I was aware of his employment here, and I said nothing. I did nothing. The silence that followed was the kind that happens after something that cannot be taken back. Patricia Owens, near the edge of the room, stood with her arms crossed and her expression fixed in careful neutrality. Greg Sutton was looking at Adrian. Dana Wexler, standing near the back wall, had the expression of someone who was simultaneously unsurprised and devastated by something she had long suspected. The board members were speaking to each other in voices too low to reach the platform. Vanessa lowered the microphone slightly. "The IPO cannot proceed on a foundation I've misrepresented. I'll be speaking with the board and with legal counsel to determine the appropriate path forward. Whatever that process looks like, it begins with this." She set the microphone on the edge of the platform and stepped off. For a moment, she stood in the room like anyone else, without the elevation of the stage, without the designed lighting, without the architecture of the evening arranged to confirm her position at its center. She looked for the first time that night like a person standing in a room rather than a CEO commanding one. Adrian crossed the space between them without urgency and stopped at a conversational distance, not close enough to suggest intimacy, not far enough to suggest confrontation. His expression contained no victory, no warmth, and no residual anger. It was the expression of someone for whom a long and exhausting chapter had just reached its final page. "I didn't come here to destroy you," Adrian said. Something in Vanessa's face reorganized into something more honest than anything she had worn all evening. "I know," she said. And she did know. She had probably known since the night she found him reading in the stairwell, when something in the back of her mind had identified the shape of what was coming and chosen not to examine it. "I think I've known for a while that this was where it ended. The work we did was real," Adrian said. "The company you built from it, most of that was yours. The decisions you made, the ideas you developed after. I'm not disputing any of it. I only ever wanted the record to be accurate." Vanessa stood with that. She did not thank him, which would have been false. She did not apologize in that moment, which would have been insufficient, and both of them understood it. She simply stood with the truth, the way you stand, with something you have avoided for a very long time. Not comfortably, but honestly. "What happens now is between you and your board," Adrian said. "And whatever it looks like, it's not my business anymore." He retrieved his card from the table where he had set it. At the beginning of the evening, slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, and walked toward the elevator. He did not make a point of his exit. He did not move slowly enough to be watched, or quickly enough to suggest retreat. He simply left the way people leave rooms when their reason for being in them has been resolved. The elevator doors closed behind him. In the room he had left, Rachel Ford was already at a corner table with her laptop open. Martin Hale gathered his partners near the bar, and they spoke in the contained, professional tones of people deciding how to reposition a significant financial commitment. The board members requested an emergency meeting with legal, which Dana Wexler began organizing on her phone before the request had finished being made. Patricia Owens, on her way out, stopped in the lobby and looked back through the glass at the room where the evening had gone so completely off its intended course. She had been to hundreds of these events. She had seen founders' stumble reputations take damage from which they never recovered. What she had not often seen was a person in a position of power choosing accuracy over survival, not because it was strategic, but because the room had finally made strategy impossible. She made a mental note of Adrian Pierce's name before she stepped out into the night. Vanessa remained in the room longer than anyone expected. She stood near the window after most of the guests had gone and looked out at the city the way she had looked out at it from above for 11 years as evidence of distance traveled. The view had not changed, but the story she had told herself about what it meant and what she had done to reach it had changed irrevocably. And she was honest enough to understand that there was no version of what came next in which that story returned. She would speak to the board in the morning. The IPO would be restructured, or it would not happen. Her position would be reviewed, or it would not survive the review. These were now questions for other people in other rooms, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, not the person who controlled the answer. She stood in the emptying room and let the quiet settle around her. She did not find it peaceful, but she found it preferable to the noise she had been making for 11 years to keep it at bay. In a world where status moves faster than truth, it is easy to forget that the two are not the same thing. Vanessa Cole built something real. She was genuinely capable, genuinely driven, genuinely intelligent. None of that was the lie. The lie was the foundation a single decision made once early under pressure to take full credit for something that did not belong to her alone. And then the years of maintenance that decision required, the careful silence, the controlled narrative, the invitation sent to a man she had wronged, designed to diminish him, that instead brought the foundation into the light. Adrian Pierce never raised his voice. He never made a scene. He had spent 6 years maintaining the building constructed on top of work that was partly his, not because he had no options, but because he had made a different calculation about what mattered. He showed up when the moment arrived, answered questions honestly, and let the room do the rest. He did not need to perform his value. He only needed the right room and enough time. The cruelest assumption you can make about a person is that their circumstances define their ceiling. Because sometimes the person you invited to be the footnote has been quietly holding the first chapter all along.